months. Prior to that, I was sort of the Husker beat writer, Husker sports coordinator, as we called it, where I just sort of coordinated all of our Nebraska coverage. I still do that, but I'm also the sports editor now. I've been at the World-Herald since 2011. Prior to being at the Omaha World-Herald, I worked for a now defunct website called NebraskaStatePaper.com. And I was hired by sort of an internet tech guy who was running a news website at the time, similar to a site that some of you may have heard of called Nebraska Examiner. It's not the same site, but similar. And I was a sports writer for him. I had been doing that for about 4 years. So I kind of ran a Husker themed website called Husker Locker. And I also wrote for this state paper website, did that for about 4 years. For some of that time, I was still working at a job. I was doing it part-time. So I think initially when I started at State Paper, which was in 2007, that was the same year that Bill Callahan was fired. I think I made $400 a month that first year, and I used to have to get my paychecks hand delivered to me, which was, an interesting experience. Prior to that, I wasn't in journalism for about 5 or 6 years. I was in, the professional work world, not doing a ton, working for insurance party administrators, working for property management company, a few of the things. I worked at the DN when I was in college. The Daily Nebraskan was very helpful to me. The Jake School was too, but back then the Daily Nebraskan kind of ran its own operation, and we had a daily newspaper that they don't have anymore, which really got you in the rhythm and the practice of having to churn out daily news every single day. The untraditional route that I took is that after college, I was not in journalism for 5, 6, 7 years. And it was after I got married. I don't know. I think I remember talking to my wife and just remembering that I had briefly worked for this guy back in the early 2000s, and on a lark, basically was like, well, maybe that website's still going. So why not try to cover some Husker football? And that's kind of how it started. And again, hired at the World-Herald in 2011. Been there for 11 years. There's been a lot of interesting stories along the way. A lot of things to cover. I cover clearly one of the most dysfunctional football programs in America. I tell the people I cover that too. I think they know it's dysfunctional, and it's been dysfunctional for some time. And so I covered, the Bo Pelini years, the tapes, the angry calls in the middle of the morning from coaches, people meeting people in secret locations, all kinds of stuff that used to happen back then. The football program then obviously was turned over to Mike Riley, a really nice guy. Things normalized a little bit on the drama front, but of course he was fired, and things haven't been quite the way they were under Bo with Scott Frost. But obviously people know there's been all kinds of things that have happened since Frost got there. Covered sports during a pandemic. Never thought I would do that. Truly unique experience. It was weird. It was interesting because what I covered during the pandemic wasn't just sports, but it was politics and health and sports and medicine, and learning things about testing protocols and how antigen tests work, and how COVID worked, how the political winds would shift, how lawsuits work, all kinds of stuff. So COVID opened a door to learning so many different things about a lot of different things. And of course, it was a horrible time for everybody. The pandemic was hard on everyone. But it challenged me in good ways. And I had to learn some other skill sets along the way, learning how to do certain things. And so the pandemic was really interesting. Covering Nebraska athletics has put me in contact with just a lot of different kinds of stories about people, about human beings, about life in the world, about how athletes are treated. I will never forget the 2011 Nebraska-Penn State game, which happened, I'd say 4 days after Joe Paterno was fired. It was at the height of the Sandusky scandal. I remember going there that weekend, not knowing exactly what would happen. So experiencing that, walking through the fans and seeing all the things that were going on outside the stadium that week, and just all the emotion that was surrounding that. I've covered programs that have fallen into scandal. I've covered some incredible athletes along the way who are some of the finest and most decent people that I've certainly ever known. I've covered a lot of coaches, and you know, along the way you learn a lot just about how you talk to people, how you do things, how coaches and athletes might be very high profile people, but at the end of the day, they're just people. Had a lot of funny phone calls along the way. Anytime you cover recruiting for any length of period of time, you run into some of the strangest conversations that you will ever have about players who you will never meet because they don't go to Nebraska. So I don't know. Over the course of 11 years at the World-Herald, I'm going to estimate I've written about 5,000 stories. That would be my estimation, which is about 400 some stories a year. And it might be more than that, but my hunch is it's somewhere around 5,000 stories. So Nebraska athletics, which is probably accounts for 4,500 of those stories, is a busy beat. And, you know, people in the state love Nebraska athletics, even when they're not very good. They love it anyway. So, but yeah, I guess that's my story. And it's been an interesting ride over the last 20 years, seeing the media industry change a lot, seeing journalism change a lot over the course of that time too. So I'm open to any questions you guys may have.
Let's see.
I'm going to drink some Diet Dr. Pepper at the same time. So.
Hello, Sam. Thank you for doing this today. So just to start out, is
What's
there
your
like,
name?
My name's Sam too, actually.
Good name.
So how do you differentiate yourself as a reporter, since obviously there are quite a few people that report on Nebraska athletics?
That's a great question. You know, there's about 45 writers that'll go to a post-game press conference, 45 journalists, I should say. It's not all writers, there's TV folks there too. A couple of things, you know, what I would say is that I break beats up into sort of 4 different categories. And I'll get a little technical here for a second, but it won't take long. One of them is the word grind, and that's just the daily stuff that you got to do. Guy gets hurt, somebody leaves the team like Casey Rogers, so on and so forth. One of them is human, and that is telling human stories about people, just telling good stories about athletes and coaches that may or may not have to do a lot with the sport they play, but it might just be a personal story. Maybe they survived a car accident. Maybe they lost a sibling or even a child in some cases, or maybe they're fighting and they won a battle against cancer. That's human. Culture is all the things that surround the beat. A lot of that's fan stuff. A lot of that is just, NIL, like covering that aspect of it, what NIL is. When we write about, for example, a 800-word story about so-and-so and such has this NIL deal, that's a culture story. And then the last one is system. And this is the one I would consider myself the best at. And that is taking complex ideas and trying to taking complex ideas and trying to simplify those in a way that is nevertheless pleasing to the reader. So I try to infuse my writing with energy and excitement and all those other things. But what I really try to do is explain to readers, okay, football is an enormously complex sport. There are a lot of different moving parts. There are a lot of different people involved in it. And each one of those people is brilliant in their own way, right? So they have these deep wells of knowledge that are somewhat siloed, like they're not completely siloed, but, you have people who have never forgotten a play call they've ever called, but they may not be good in other areas. My job is to try to synthesize all of that data and all of that information and tell you this is what matters. And this is why they win, or in the case of Nebraska football over several recent years, why they lose. The other thing that I try to do is I try to take fans where I'm at. And so I try to pay a lot of attention to when we're at road games or we're doing interviews to try to place fans in the context that I'm in so that they can feel that and sense that. And so I try very hard to not just look at an interview as a series of quotes, or turn a story into a series of transcriptions or sentence, big quote, sentence, big quote, but to try to write the best story I can that helps the readers understand where I'm at, who I'm covering, and what it all means. And so that may be a broad way of explaining that, but I think that's what good journalists do. We're not merely transcription services. We're not court reporters sitting right next to the judge, writing everything. We're not transcribers. We're interpreters, and we're cultural interpreters. That's what sports reporters do, is they interpret culture, sports culture, and how the ways in which that interface is. And the other thing that I do, and everyone else does this too, but I think a lot about what I cover. I think about it. I think about all the dynamics, all the things that are, all the moving parts within the context of what I cover. And I try to be as, detailed and consistent as possible about what I'm saying. And I also try very hard as I write to keep hitting the same narratives over and over that I think are important. For example, in Nebraska football, I would say that I'm a person that tries to place Nebraska football in the context of its peers, that is the Big Ten, a lot more than other people do. Some people will try to place Nebraska football in the context against the teams that it used to be in the 90s, or the teams that it used to be in the 80s, or they will try to place Scott Frost in the context of, well, is he like Mike Riley, or is he like Bill Callahan? I don't do as much of that. I try to take where Nebraska is and the context it's in and compare it to the peers that it has to beat. And the peers that it has to beat are Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Northwestern, and Purdue. That's Nebraska's reality, not the future, not the past, but the present. And so what I try to do for readers is explain to them, you're really passionate about Nebraska football. I'm going to tell you why they win or lose, and I'm going to tell you how they can win or lose in the future. So that's what I try to do to differentiate myself.
Hey, Sam, my name's Peyton. Thanks for the time. You mentioned near the end of your experience that people will crave Nebraska football no matter how terrible they may be. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about when the team is good, how does that add challenges or take away challenges to what you do? And when the team's bad, how does it impact it as well?
Well, the one thing I can't control is whether they win or lose. This is one thing I can't do. And so one of the things you have to do as a writer is you have to settle yourself with the reality that if this is what you have, this is what you have, and you have to write it. And you have to, it's got to matter to you the way that you imagine it would matter to a fan. So I don't look at losing teams, generally speaking, as any less of a story than winning teams. And that's not something that's easy for everybody to do. But I try to, again, always look at where things are at and where it could go and where it has been. When a team's winning, it's actually a heck of a lot easier. And here's why. Because all of a sudden, athletes that may not want to have talked if they weren't winning, all of a sudden they want to talk. And athletes have great stories. Student athletes have terrific stories. And we don't always get to hear some of those when a team's losing, because it's just hard, man. It's like I think it's hard for us as for me as a non-student athlete to appreciate how difficult that is for student athletes that don't always win. And so, that's been one of the journeys is that, when teams win, people are more apt to talk. They're more open. Who doesn't want to talk about success? Who doesn't want to talk about those things? And so that tends to be good, right? More people are reading when they're winning. The stakes go higher and higher. For example, I cover Nebraska women's basketball too. We have an intern that helps me with that, but I cover that too. And as they won more games this year, more and more people were interested in how they were doing. And it opens the door to tell more and more and deeper stories because people are more willing to talk about that stuff. And so that's one of the advantages. There are some challenges that come along with that, but they're minor in the sense that like a team could be 9-1 and they could play a really big game and they could lose. Maybe they could lose by a lot. Maybe they lose by 31. And, there's an understandable instinct of like, well, hey, we won 9 games. What are you getting on us for this one? It's just a bad game. And you got to kind of write it the way it is. When a team's not very good, people aren't as excited to talk. You feel like you're constantly covering coaching changes, which can be challenging because every single time they switch out a head coach in a sport, you know what we got to do? we got to figure out who the new head coach is going to be, and then who that head coach is going to hire, and who's going to leave and who's going to stay. And so there's this inventory of stories that all of a sudden you have to write in an off season when there's a coaching change, and sometimes those are fun. When Scott Frost came the coach here at Nebraska, we had a heck of a good time. We wrote a book about Scott Frost coming home. Let's see if I can find it here. I don't know. Where's it at? We wrote a book about Scott Frost coming home. And so we kind of wrote a book about, his childhood and his upbringing, and that was fun. Other times when new coaches come on, it's harder. It can be hard to write about fired coaches, all those things. And so oftentimes when teams lose, there's more change, and you always have to cover, there's like an inventory of stories. So like, let's say you have on your heart this idea to write this just super story on a student athlete. And, they got a great story and they're a great student athlete. And the challenge is maybe the team isn't winning as much. And then the secondary challenge after that challenge is, well, maybe there's a new coach and these other things. And this inventory list of stories that you have to do because the fans are really interested gets in the way. And so that's one of the challenges that comes with a losing team. But at the end of the day, you got to cover what's there, and you can't have too much of a whatever about it. If a team's winning, there's still people. If a team's losing, there's still people.
Hi, Sam. My name is Marco. Thank you so much for your time. Just
Marco.
talking about, thanks. And just going off of what you were saying about coaches being hired and fired, how do you try to maintain good relationships with sources, but still using them for good information, but not necessarily using them, and trying to balance personal and professional dynamics with people?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And you could get a very similar answer from 7 different journalists. I want to say this the right way. You could get a very similar answer about that from 7 different journalists who all actually have different approaches and different worldviews about that. So I'll try to be the person who doesn't give you a similar answer. I think some of it is related to your personality, and some people are better at cultivating certain sources than others are. Some people are better at cultivating source A versus source B. Sometimes it's just easier to build a relationship with somebody because you got something in common with them. Sometimes the coach or the player is really just, it just works, or there's a connection, or there's a relationship. When I was in college, there were a couple of those situations on the Nebraska football team. There's people I knew, guys that I knew from high school. And so, it was pretty easy in some ways. But sometimes that can be hard too, like you just don't always know the challenge. And then there's different kinds of journalists, and we need to be really honest about that. There's certain things that I'm going to listen to and hear and receive, but I'm not going to carry the water for X, Y, or Z. And there are some reporters who will. And there are reasons for that. There's some people who are just more open to being a cipher or, what they might call the house organ. And I would say that I'm on the more reluctant end of that. I don't get it. I'd say I get quite a bit of gossip, but I don't get all the gossip. There's some people that get more. Because I think I probably have cultivated a relationship of, you can tell me that, but it's not going to make it into my coverage, and I might just be skeptical of what you're saying. And so I tend to have a little bit more of a harder news filter of like, trust but verify. Like okay, you're going to say that, well, prove it, prove that. Let's put it on the record. I have less tolerance for 3-hour conversations off the record where nothing can be used, but it's for my own edification. And it tends to be, just relentless complaints about one person. I'm probably less the person who gets those conversations than others. Nevertheless, you have to source build, and people do that in different ways. I do it my way. Other people do it their way. And everybody's a little bit different. And you'll see that when you read, you'll see that reflected in the coverage too. Like if you read it really close, you'll know the difference between somebody that basically just reports whatever they're told and somebody who rarely reports what they're told because A, they might be skeptical of it. B, they're not sure if they trust the person who said it. And C, different news organizations have different standards. And so source building is really important, but I got to tell you, it's a tricky thing. And it's more tricky in hard news and politics than it is in sports. And you can look back over how journalism has been over the last 15 to 20 years, and you can just see circumstances where journalists are just way too close to their sources. They're just too close. And they end up parroting things that are inaccurate or they're just wrong. And so it's a challenge. There needs to be just a little bit of a remove that a journalist has from the people they cover. And there needs to be just a little bit of a loneliness there, just a little, because you don't work for your sources. You work your sources and you cover your sources, but you don't work for them. Your customer, the person who's actually paying to read your content, is the reader. And so that's challenge. Like a lot of people flip those. A lot of people think, I kind of work for the coach because if the coach won't tell me what I need to hear, then my readers won't get what they need to get. Yes and no. But you'll hear a different answer from a lot of people on that. I'm just trying to tell you how it kind of actually is.
Hi, Sam. My name is Evan, and
Yeah,
I'm wondering, since being a columnist, requires you to, give out opinionated content at times, have you ever received backlash, whether it was from a player, a coach, the fans? Have you ever received backlash for an opinion or a column that you published?
Absolutely. All the time. Yeah, I get lots of criticism. And you won't be surprised in hearing this, but I get criticism that I'm either too hard or too soft, or that I'm right about this, but wrong about this. Someone else will say I'm wrong about this, but I'm right about this. Generally speaking, people are all across the spectrum of what they think of what you do. There's some people that think I'm terrible, and they will tell me anyway. They'll say, I don't read what you write, but you're horrible. So you get those. You get people who have substantive critiques. They'll tell you always get people who will tell you don't really know what you're talking about. That you don't really understand the sport of football, which is, I frequently say I'm not a coach or a player. I'm not that. No more if I were a film critic, would I be a director? So I think that's baked in and it's understood, but there's still people that have a hard time with that. But I think for the most part, I would say that I'm relatively. I think people know that I don't take cheap shots. I try not to. I try to be nuanced. And I'm not our lead columnist. Tom Chattel is our lead columnist, and so he takes more of the harder stances on certain things. I don't call for coaches really to get fired or for somebody to be, thrown off a team. And the other thing is we're not a pro sports market. And pro sports fans are way more intense than college sports fans. At the end of the day, college sports fans are all pretty nice. They're not all nice. I get it. There's some rotten ones too, but compared to professional sports fans, college sports fans are better. They're kinder.
Hey Sam, it's Casey. I appreciate the shout out earlier.
How you doing?
What's going on? My question is, what's it like covering a team where there's so many other publications out there writing stories daily? How do you keep track of what you're covering versus what another publication's covering, and how do you go about that?
So I would say this, that there are probably 4 or 5 outlets that cover the same thing I cover. So I can list those off. I work for the Omaha World-Herald, the Journal Star, Husker Online, Nebraska 247, What am I up to? 5. And then Hill Varsity. I think that's all of them. And then the Athletic. The Athletic has one writer and, you know, all the rest. And so, but they don't do quite as much. They're sort of, they do bigger picture things. So they're not every day. So I read, I'll write what I write, and I'll also read what our other writers. We have 2 other writers that cover Nebraska football, in Evan and Jimmy, what they write. And then I'll go back and look at the coverage, you know, of other websites and newspapers. Sometimes somebody gets a story you don't get, right? So when you get a story you're going to read that. That doesn't happen a ton. I will say that, but and hasn't happened that I can recall recently. But yeah, those are probably the websites I read. You know, I have a ton of respect for TV and radio. But I don't get to as much of that content. I try to get to some of it, but I don't, you know, if you're not, I don't live in Omaha, I live here in Lincoln. And if, you know, I don't see Channel 7 up there. I don't get it on TV down here. So, I'd say primarily those outlets, and, you know, and I read it with some regularity. I think you got to kind of know, what's out there. At the same time, again, you know, some of it's behind paywalls. I don't pay for all the sites, so I'm not necessarily reading everything that's written. So I don't always know everything that's out there. And I always try to make it really hard to, hey, I'm going to write my own thing first and do my own reporting. And then after the fact, maybe a day or 2 after, I'll read it, just to kind of get a sense of what I got right and what I got wrong, or not. That's not right. Not what I got right and what I got wrong. What I did versus what someone else did, and whether I thought what they did was better than what I did. Which happens sometimes, you know. It's like, yeah, I wish I would have written that, or I wish I would have pointed it out that way, or that's a good point, or that was a good thing. Like, you got to do that. And I read my own colleagues' writing. To be very honest with you, in some cases, so I'm the sports editor, so technically I'm sort of the boss. I don't feel that way because I was a writer for so long. But a lot of times, some of the best thoughts about Nebraska football come from my own colleagues. And you want to talk about challenging, when somebody from your own team puts it right on the spot, and it's like, it makes you step your own game up. No matter what career you go into, I don't care what it is, try to surround yourself with the best possible people who will challenge you and make you better. Because even though that's hard, and it has been hard at times to see somebody do really good work that I wish I had done, even though that's hard, it stretches you and it makes you better. So try to find organizations, whether you're the boss or you're somewhere else, that makes you feel like you're maximizing your potential. And I feel like that's happened a lot at the World-Herald. Not every day, but it happens with some consistency. And so now I'm in a position to hire people, and I've hired 2 writers. And in both cases, I've hired very young writers who I think are honestly better writers than I am, and have a very different worldview than I do. So Jimmy is 26, and Joel, who we just hired to cover Creighton, is 22. So he's your age, and he just graduated from Missouri in December. So we hired a really young writer who's smarter than I am, and honestly a better writer than I am, to cover basketball, and is going to come in and is going to tell me I'm full of it. Because I need to get stretched. I need to get challenged. And so I wanted to go out and try to find people who can make us better by challenging what we think. And so I try to hire for what I would call creative tension. So you're always looking for people who you can surround yourself with that make you better. And if it's a competitor, that's good too. But boy, I'd rather have that person as a colleague. Anyone else? Can anyone hear me? Okay. All right. I wasn't sure.
Can you hear me, Sam?
Yes.
No, it's working. Might just be far away. I don't know.
All right, we're gonna try it again, Sam.
I
All right, check. Got me? All right. When you're not covering football or more than just football, what's your favorite sport to write about?
Great question. Well, to be honest with you, I don't write about a ton of other sports. But I can kind of run down for you what it's kind of like. Basketball's fun to write about if you're watching a great performance. I've covered women's basketball for a long time. Honestly, I like women's basketball a lot. I like women's volleyball a lot, but I don't cover it that often. Those are probably two of my favorite college sports. I'll tell you what, I love watching golf. I've covered a couple golf tournaments, and unless you're doing that every week, that ain't something I'd want to do. And let me tell you why. I don't know if a lot of you are golfers or not. What happens at golf tournaments, I've covered a couple, I covered a Senior Open and a couple others, is you kind of stick like close to the 18th hole and you're in sort of the command center and you're watching the tournament, but you're not like out on the course. So it's like a worse seat than you'd have at home. And then you wait for the golfers to finish and then you got to go out and talk to them. Then you go back to the command center. And it just isn't, it feels like you're in a command center all day and you're not actually watching a lot of golf. So golf didn't do it for me. I come from a baseball family. So I had, everybody in my family but me was really good at baseball. And I had a nephew and a nephew and two nieces play college baseball and softball. So I like watching those sports, but they can be hard to write about. I'm still getting used to writing about the College World Series, which we do every year. So basketball is probably number two. And then among the smaller sports, I kind of like watching wrestling and I kind of like tennis. Tennis is fun too. Tennis is, it's hard. I don't read a lot about tennis, but tennis is a great sport. So I like watching that on TV. And I like writing about it on the few occasions that I can.
Hey, Sam, my name's Alec. Question for you is a little bit more big picture. Do you have any predictions for the future of journalism or sports journalism specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, there's a lot of different things going on. We can talk about sports journalism. My suspicion of sports journalism is it's going to become even more fragmented as we go on. When I came to college in 1996, which was, oh my God, a long time ago, too long ago, 25 years ago. You want to know how many people are at practice? About 12. About 12 people. The World-Herald was there. The Journal-Star was there. Maybe a writer from the AP was there, and the Daily Nebraskan was there, maybe a television station, and that was it. Now we've got a lot more, and that's because the democratization of the internet. And it's not a bad thing. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for that Nebraska State paper site. So I always have a soft spot for the underdogs in the media, and I don't work for an underdog anymore, at least not within the context of the Nebraska media. And so I think it's going to get more fragmented, and here's why. You're going to see more and more media outlets get streaming of sporting events, okay? So, you're going to see the industry continue to fragment because Amazon Prime is, Amazon Prime, it's just Amazon. Amazon's going to broadcast the Thursday night NFL game, and there's a pretty good chance that Amazon's going to get one of these college contracts, whether it's the Big Ten or the Pac-12, which is coming up again. I think the Big 12 is coming up again. Well, that's a whole new division of sports that they're going to have to create. You're going to have broadcasters, you're going to have camera operators, you're going to have writers, you're going to have producers, and they're all going to work for Amazon. And then you're going to see these smaller networks kind of pop up again, like Flow Sports, which some people may know what that is. You watch track on it, other things. So you're going to see more specialized departments, and you're going to see more like production related jobs around the audio and video production of sports. The act of writing about sports or doing those things is going to be a little less likely over time. I don't know if that's the right word or not. You're still going to have sports writers, but more and more you've got to get better at the writing, at the talking, and the podcasting, and the video casting, and those other things as time goes on. That's where the shift in the industry is going to go. You've got to get better at that piece of it. So one of the things that I like about the university that you guys are in and the major that you have is that you're learning a lot of things. So you're not just learning how to write, or you're not just learning, you're learning the whole thing. You're learning a little bit about everything. And that's my sense of what it's going to take going forward, is being really well-rounded. And, at this point, I don't know, I think there's probably going to be just as many jobs in sports media, but I think it's going to be a little bit more toward the audio visual end of it. And if you want to be a writer, and just a straight up writer, you better learn how to talk, or you better be an all day kind of person. You got to write 500 stories a year. Like the writing piece is labor intensive. I write a lot. Lincoln Journal Star's Parker Gabriel writes a lot. Husker Online, Sean Callahan writes a lot. You got to be busy. We're probably all writing 4 to 6 things a week. So if you're going to go into sports journalism, be prepared to work a lot, because you're going to work a lot. That's just part of you're always creating content because fans are excited.
Hey, Sam, thanks for being here today. I'm Craig.
Hey, Greg.
And you talked a little bit about Chattel. Chattel recently said that he wouldn't set an expectation around 8 wins. It'd be less than that. So I was kind of wondering, since you said you can't control wins or losses, but you can control fan expectations to some degree. So what are kind of your expectations for the program going forward?
Well, I mean, I think what's more fair to do is to, and this is annoying. I know that I can be an annoying person in this way, is that what I try to do is think about, again, the context that Nebraska's in. Nebraska was a 3-9 team last year, but I'm telling you, you put them in a different division, in a different league, and they're not 3-9. The peers that they have around them, at least last year for sure, were really good. And that's not to make any excuses, but that's just to acknowledge reality, that Nebraska, at one point, if you go back 25 years, Nebraska was in a league where Nebraska had more money than almost everybody but Texas and Oklahoma. And Nebraska, Texas, and Oklahoma had more money than everybody else. And a lot of schools had not really pivoted to football the way that they have now. Like, you go back in the 1980s and the early 1990s, and you look at, for example, Kansas was horrible in football. Well, they're bad now too, but no offense to Kansas, but they didn't really used to try that hard at being good. They built a basketball program in the 80s, and it remains great today. Kansas State, which is a strong program right now, was also a very poor team in the 80s. And it wasn't necessarily because they were bad people. They didn't try very hard, because they put a lot of their eggs in the basketball basket. Because at that time, people didn't realize that football was going to become the moneymaker it did. Well, guess what? In the 90s and in the early 2000s, schools like Kansas State and Missouri, and they started pouring a lot of money into their programs. And guess what? They got a little bit better. And Nebraska got a little bit worse. And all of a sudden, those games where Nebraska might have won 25 in a row against the team, they didn't win 25 in a row anymore. They might win 3. The other team might win 2. The same thing is true in the Big Ten. So, everybody's getting $50 million. And Nebraska's getting a lot of money, don't get me wrong. But all of their peers are getting the same amount. And so the expectation that old school Nebraska fans have, let's say people who are older than me, they have the memories of Nebraska steamrolling all these teams from the 90s. And don't get me wrong, the teams in the 90s were terrific. I was here for one of the national title teams in 97. But the context has changed. The internet makes it easier for Iowa and Indiana and these teams to recruit good players too. And their facilities, while not maybe quite as good as Nebraska's, are still really good. And, Iowa, for example, has a nice football facility. When I started at the World-Herald in 2011, I'm not kidding you, Iowa practiced in a bubble that was like 109 degrees in the summer. That's all they had, because they didn't have a lot of money. And then the Big Ten TV contracts kicked in, and now they got a nice football building too. And so the playing field has leveled out. And Nebraska might be a bit ahead in nutrition or facilities once their new building opens, but they're not 900% ahead like they used to be. And so part of managing fan expectations is letting them know that the teams around Nebraska are pretty good. And Is that going to change a little bit this year? I think a little. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that some of the teams are quite as good, and they don't have to play Ohio State, which is good. Ohio State's a great team, and Nebraska hasn't beaten Ohio State since 2011. So it's probably good news that they're not playing Ohio State. That's a hard team to beat any day of the week. So yeah, I mean, I think they've got a chance to win more games. I think the likelihood of them winning 6 is actually pretty high. But it's hard. It's hard to go higher than that. And honestly, I said they were going to win 7 last year, and they could have. They didn't finish the games. You know, if you ended a lot of those games in the third quarter, you'd really like where Nebraska was at. You know, they beat Michigan State. If that game ends, they beat Michigan. But you know, there's just a few plays here or there in the last 5 minutes of a couple of games that change the narrative on those games. And that's one of the reasons why Nebraska made some coaching changes in the offseason, I think, is they just had to get a little bit better in certain areas. And I thought after Nebraska lost the game against Minnesota last year, I have a Monday rewind that I write every year. Yeah, after every game. And after that one, I was like, I don't think you can bring all these offensive coaches back. And it wasn't personal to any of them. They're all really great guys, but you could just tell it wasn't quite working. And at the end of the year, they kept one, and they let go of 4 others, and they replaced them. And I do like the new guys they've got. But you know, we'll see. I think at this point, Nebraska football has had 4 or 5 straight losing seasons. And so you're at a moment where it's like, well, you know, you can't just assume they're going to bounce back. They're going to have to probably prove it at this point. For what it's worth, I think they can. And I'm not as pessimistic as some other people, nor am I saying they're going to win the Big Ten. I think they're in a really hard league, guys and gals. They're in a hard league. It's a very, very good league with a lot of money and a lot of good football players, and people I think have to have an appreciation for that. The Big Ten in general is a better athletic league than the Big 12 was when Nebraska left it. And they've learned that. There's some sports in the Big Ten, including basketball, that are pretty tough. And you know, it's just not easy to win in the Big Ten. There are a lot of good schools.
Hey, Sam, it's Marco again. I was just curious about what are some mistakes that you made early in your writing career that you had to learn from, but ultimately made you a better writer?
Great question. Terrific question. When Bo Pelini, was it Bo? Yeah, I think, okay. So when Bill Callahan was fired, Nebraska looked at like a handful of coaches, and Bo was one of them, and Bo became the head coach. It's Bo Pelini and Turner Gill and Jim Grobe. I don't know if you guys know who he is, but he was a Wake Forest head coach, and then he became the Baylor interim head coach for a year. But I think I misreported something about a plane that I thought Jim Grobe was on. This is back when we used to go to FlightAware and look at plane tail numbers. But I was wrong, and I had to retract it. This was like in 2007, literally. That was a difficult moment. But you know, you learn to be a little bit smarter with your verification on that. And I didn't have any sources at the time, so it was very hard for me to call, and I was just trying to be eager. And so don't be over eager. I think that's one of the lessons you learn. If you don't have it, have it. If you don't have a source that can confirm it, don't try to derive that off of a flight website. Don't take unnecessary chances there. Some of the lessons that I've learned, to be very honest with you, are just, you know, how I'm in an interview and I can tell, and this happens whenever. You have to learn how to shut up in interviews. Got to learn when to do that and when to draw a person out. And for me, that's just an ongoing journey. Like, there's some people who have just an unbelievable gift at being able to nail that every time. I don't know that I always do. But I know when an interview went really well, and I know when an interview didn't. And I know people that I jibed with really well. for example, I had a really good rapport with the former athletic director, Bill Moose. I did. Like he said things to me that he didn't always say to other people. And we just had a good rapport where we could talk about a lot of things. I feel like I have a good rapport with the current athletic director too, but you want to talk about a different person. I mean, Bill and Trevor, not similar people. So, like you learn when you're doing interviews, when to shut up, when to allow silence to take over. That's another thing I think you guys should think about, is sometimes in an interview setting, even though this is hard on television, silence is a most effective question. If you're a writer, silence can be very effective, because that silence grows, and then the person will either go, do you have any other questions? Or they'll fill it with whatever was really on their mind. And so sometimes you have to use silence, and sometimes you have to learn how to do other things. I'll tell you a lesson I learned from a story that I didn't break that someone else did, is to trust what you have and go with it. There was a situation about 5-6 years ago with a coach who was let go, and I had the story, and I think my editor was a little trepidatious at the time, and so I borrowed that trepidation. And at the end of the day, I knew I was right about the story, and I should have convinced my editor that I was to be trusted on it, and we would have broken that story. But that happens sometimes. Those are kind of the lessons that you learn. When I was in college, there are all kinds of stupid things, but those tend to be things that the kind of mistakes you make in college. Yeah, that would be what I would say. So I'll tell you this story. And this is, when I was in college, Bill Clinton, the president of the United States, had not come to the state of Nebraska until the very end of his time as president. So he'd been in office for like almost 8 years, and he had never come to Nebraska. When he finally decided to come to Nebraska, he went to Kearney, to the Arch. Does anybody know what the Arch is? Kearney? Yeah, cool. Good, great. He went there, and I think he went to UNK. Well, somebody was mad about it at our paper at the DN, and they wrote an ad for, wow, I should have come to UNL. Whatever. Well, we had a columnist. I was the opinion editor at the time. To repeat, I was the opinion editor. I did not write this, but I was the editor. And we had a columnist, a humor columnist. And anybody who's ever read the DN knows that humor is, whatever, but a humor columnist who I still remain in touch with today, and great person, who wrote a humor column, sort of humorous, about when a president leaves office, what do? They pardon people, right? They do this big list of pardons. Our humor columnist wanted Clinton to pardon Leonard Peltier. Probably don't know who that is. You can look him up. And she made a joke, and it was a joke, that if he didn't do that, she would shoot him in the elbow. Shoot him in the elbow with a pistol or something. Well, that ran in the paper. I for some reason, as an editor, I didn't catch it fast enough or something. And our page editors didn't lock in their mind. But when we got a visit from the Secret Service the next day, it made sense to everybody. And that was a humbling moment. So the Secret Service came down to the Daily Nebraskan, and she worked at a sandwich shop down in the Haymarket that's not there anymore. I think it was Maggie something. Can't remember the name of it. And they went to the sandwich shop, and I felt so bad for her because I should have caught that. But that's a lesson that you learn in college, right? So like when people tell me, what was the weirdest situation you ever win? I was like, well, honestly, it was in college. And I was visited by the Secret Service, who wanted to ask if the writer had any real serious intentions of hurting President Clinton. And I said, I assure you no. But so that was a lesson. But that's not something that would happen at a professional newspaper. It's something that happened at the campus newspaper. There's my story.
Hey, Sam, it's Sam again.
Hey.
Is there anyone in the industry that you look up to, like as an influence when you write or report?
Oh shoot, yeah. So one thing I would say is that you've got to get really good at reading other people's stuff, or if you're going to go into television or radio, listening to people that you admire. But heck yeah, there's a ton of people that I admire. Some of them are people who I work with now. One of my colleagues, Dirk Chatlin's one of the best journalists I know. My former editor-in-chief at the Daily Nebraskan, her name is Paula Levine, and she works for ESPN, and she does investigative journalism. She just recently co-wrote a piece on a Penn State football player who was a rapist back in the late 70s. It's a stunning story. It's a long read, but it was really, really something to read. I admire Paula a great deal. So yeah, I can't do what she does. I'm not, to be honest with you, I'm not as good as she is, but I admire the way that the tenacity and her empathy and her reporting. So there's that. When it comes to analytics and just like breaking the game down, there's a ton of people that I like to read. There's people in the NBA that I like to read. I like watching the NBA. I don't cover it or write about it, but I like watching it. And in the NFL, there's a lot of really good writers. My favorite writer in the NFL, his name is Seth Wickersham. Does anybody know who that is? He's really good. And so he wrote recently a book about Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots called It's Better to Be Feared. And it's a good book. I mean, Wickersham's really, really good. He's just a great reporter. He's written stories about Jim Harbaugh. He wrote stories about, one of my favorite stories he ever wrote was about Bill Walsh. Bill Walsh wrote a coaching book, and it's viewed as kind of like a Bible among some coaches. And there's not many copies of it because Bill Walsh didn't actually like the book. And so they cut off the printing of it. And so there's only 3,000 of them out there. And so it was just this fascinating story about this book that coaches covet. And it's pretty hard to get your hands on. It's pretty expensive. So Seth Wickersham is somebody that I really admire. I admire a writer who no longer works at ESPN named Bonnie Ford, who wrote about Olympic sports. Just a beautiful writer, just a really, really gifted writer. There's lots of columnists that I admire quite a bit. There's beat writers that I like. There's a couple for The Athletic. Nick Baumgartner, who works for The Athletic Detroit, but he covers Michigan and Michigan State football. I think he really gets the game, gets it better than I do. And so I like reading his stuff. It's good at breaking stuff down and kind of getting inside of things. And so I like reading people who really know their stuff and also have an ability to write in a way that's also broad enough that I feel like it connects with readers. Because I think when you get too technical, you get off into the weeds, and readers don't, my audience, there's a person who's 27 and is working 70 hours a week as a chef. And there's a person who's 74 who likes the Huskers, but also kind of likes the Yankees and likes watching the Yankees 100 times a year. And when he looks at the Huskers, he doesn't want every single detail. He just kind of wants a general picture of how are they going to be? Because I'm going to watch the Yankees tonight. So I have to keep in mind that the audience that I'm writing for is broad and diverse, and they're not coaches. A lot of them are just fans who love the team and who are almost uniformly positive and want to hear about Husker football in a way that's broadly enough written that it can be understood. And so I try to look for writers like that. Sally Jenkins is probably the best columnist. She works for the Washington Post. People can't duplicate what she does, but she's really good. Dan Wetzel, who works for Yahoo. Dan Wetzel's really, really good. And I would encourage people to read him. Notice I didn't name a lot of long form people. That's not really what I do. Most people will tell you, go read the 9,000 word thing written by Gary Smith. Gary Smith's fine to me. He's great. That would not be that's not what I am drawn toward. I'm not drawn toward that. I'm drawn toward people who write columns and who write investigative pieces, and write, 900 to 1,200 words. I'm not looking for the person who, writes 3 stories a year and writes 12,000 words when they do.
Hi, Sam. It's Evan again.
Hey.
I'm wondering if there's anything that you could change about your journey or your career, what would it be?
Oh, wow. I don't know. Certainly there's stories that I wish I'd broken over the years, relationships that I wish I'd nailed down better. Not much, like, I mean, I'll tell you what I would change is that there was a period of time when I wasn't in it. And that was mostly because of just life choices I made that had nothing to do with not wanting to be in journalism. And I probably would have, there were some doors that were open to me, right as I was getting out of college, that I just didn't walk through. People, jobs or potential opportunities. I think I was probably dealing with some level of depression. That's not an excuse, but there was some of that in there. And so I didn't know that at the time. It's things I didn't know. So yeah, that would probably be it. There's opportunities where if you can walk through an open door and there's an opportunity to do something, I encourage all of you to do that, and so I didn't walk through an open door exactly. When I went back to the industry, I kind of went to a wall and made a door and knocked on it, and the guy opened it and said, yeah, okay, I'll pay you $400, which is, to think about it now, it really was something that I was doing that. Fortunately, I had another job at the time, but I would literally leave work at 4:30, and I would drive down to Bill Callahan's press conference, which would always end post practice, which would end around 5:36. And so, like, Scott has his practices in the morning. So the post practice interviews are at like 10:45, 11. If I had the job that I had and I couldn't have gone to practice because I was working. So I would leave work at like 4:30, and I would like drive as fast as possible down to the stadium so I could be there when Bill Callahan talked to the media. So I was just fortunate, but I would have walked through some open doors.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for talking to us today. My name's Nathan.
Hey.
I just kind of like some of your thoughts on the landscape of NIL in the country right now, and then specifically like how Nebraska is handling it.
Well, I'm writing a story about that actually, and talked to a number of people. What I can tell you is that you could talk to 10 people associated with NIL, and they could all have different opinions based on the perspective from where they stand. An athlete, for example, has their own perspective. A coach has his or her own perspective. Somebody who works for ABM, which is one of the branding agencies here in Nebraska, has their perspective. The athletic director, Trev Alberts, has his perspective. And so, and they're not all the same. I think that would be the way I would put it. The broad point that I would make is that the NCAA waited far too long to allow student athletes to actually get extra stipend payments for academic achievement, which is what Nebraska is going to fund now, but B, allow student athletes to profit off of their name, image, and likeness. And by too long, I mean many decades, but specifically a decade, like the last 8 or 9 years. And the NCAA's inability to address that, or unwillingness to address it, or maybe they thought it was going to go away, has created a situation now where the market is relatively deregulated, and there aren't a lot of guardrails or guidelines around it. Anytime you have a deregulated market, and this doesn't have anything specifically to do with sports, but just how markets work, I'm sure an economics professor would tell me I'm an idiot, but I'll say this anyway. Anytime you have a deregulated market, you have a lot of people who are really nervous about how that market might move because nobody can easily predict it. And so in talking to people for this NIL story, they wouldn't have been able to predict that a year ago now, there would be these things called collectives where boosters would pool their resources together and, give money to student athletes to, do interviews or appearances or things like that. I think everybody would have said brands, like entrepreneurial stuff, appearances, radio shows. Yeah, that's all going to happen. But the collectives moved really quickly, and they're now a reality. And so obviously that's a factor in what everybody's doing. And so I think everybody's trying to figure out how those work. Broadly speaking, I think it's time. It's well past time that student athletes who are making, and don't get me wrong, scholarships great, like I don't have many student loans left, but it would have been great not to have them. So I'm not diminishing the value of a scholarship, but we got to be clear that you've got a lot of people making a lot of money, and student athletes weren't able to make that. And so I think it's well past time that they're able to maximize that. I think there at the same time are some reasonable concerns about, here's the concern that I think would be fair, is that there could be some situations where deals are signed or deals are presented and then they don't come to fruition because the money's not there, or there's a misunderstanding. And so the thing that I don't want to see happen is athletes get on the bad end of a bad deal. That would be what I would say, is that hopefully there's a way to protect against that. Maybe there isn't, but you don't want to see somebody, for example, a kid that's in the 2023 recruiting class sign with school X based on a collective saying, hey, if you sign here, we're going to give you X amount of dollars over 4 years. And then guess what? Somebody has a bad day and they invested, they did something they shouldn't have and invested some of the collective money in a money market, and the amount of money gone. So now I'm not saying that a collective in Nebraska would do that, but I can almost guarantee you that sooner or later there's going to be a collective out there that doesn't pay up. And I'd hate to see that happen to any student athlete anywhere. And so I think there may be a way where you can put some guardrails around this conversation. And it's tricky. It's a fascinating time. If people are really interested in markets and watching a market form, you're getting to watch a pretty pure market right now, because in the NFL, for example, if a guy's in the NFL, Deebo Samuel, everybody here, he wants a trade, right? The 49ers. Well, Deebo Samuel doesn't get to just go wherever he wants to go, like based on who's going to pay him the NIL money, like he has to request a trade. And in college sports right now, it's a little bit different. Like, there's a freedom of movement that is rare for almost any sports market. And it's kind of fun to watch. Like, it's interesting. Because you don't get to see markets this deregulated most of the time. Most of the time they're overly regulated, right? So for decades, the NCAA overregulated the market. And you want to know what happened? Cam Newton gets, a suitcase full of money, right? That's what happens. And so like the NCAA overregulated the market, so it created this secondary market of illegal payments, that kind of stuff. And now we have the opposite. We have a deregulated market. And it's kind of interesting to watch. So that's how I look at this story. It's not just a sports story, but it's kind of like a story about, this is one of the freest markets that you'll ever see, at least for now. And what does that look like?
Hey, Sam, is there a story that you've written that stuck with you as kind of the best work you've done, or your favorite piece that you've written?
Well, there have been. It may surprise you what those things are. They're not necessarily stories that have won awards, and I've won some of those. There was a story about a kickoff specialist named Spencer Lindsay, who was a close friend of Sam Foltz, who passed away in a car accident. And Spencer had a brother. And his brother was hurt badly in a car accident. I think that's, yeah. Well, no, his sister was hurt badly in the car accident. His brother was in that accident too, and his brother passed away from something else, from cancer. So there's just been a lot of heartache in Spencer's life, and it was. I told his story. Just a great and strong person who had a big heart, not only for his brother but for his sister. And all that. That was a meaningful story to me, and I don't think it won any awards. I'm still proud of a story that I wrote actually about Michael Phelps. So Omaha used to own the swim trials, and I went down to Dallas for the Olympic. There's like a big media event down there, and they wouldn't let anybody talk to Michael Phelps, right? He's the biggest star in the world at that point in 2012. I mean, he really was. It was Tiger Woods and it was Michael Phelps. Phelps was a big deal. And so they wouldn't let any media, like he didn't come out to the podium and do any of that. And so I went up into like this hotel where they were doing a photo shoot for NBC. And I kind of snuck into a photo shoot and just watched him in that environment have to do all the weird things they were asking him to do. And I felt like it was a really good image because Michael Phelps has always been uncomfortable with his status in the sport. He's kind of an introverted guy. He's not the person, he's not Ryan Lochte. And I wrote a story about Phelps, and then I wrote a story about Lochte. And so I felt like that moment showed a lot about him because he really did not enjoy going through that, all the things they were asking him to do. And you could just tell, like, what he really wanted to do was be a swimmer and just swim all day long and not have to do any of the media stuff. And so I thought I captured that well. So that one, and then I'm proud of some of the things that I wrote about women's basketball around the time that Connie Yori resigned and Amy Williams was hired. That was a tough time for the program in general, and I think some important things had to be written. The other thing I would say that it's notable. I wasn't proud of it, but I feel like I wrote some things during COVID. I was proud of it, but I felt like I wrote a thing during COVID about how Nebraska needed to stay in the Big Ten, while simultaneously feeling ostracized by the Big Ten because the Big Ten didn't want to play football and Nebraska did. But the value of staying in the league and not leaving for the Big 12, because there was that moment where everybody was like, oh, let's just go back to the Big 12. And I felt like what I wrote was true. And the university reached out to me and said, we appreciate that. And they didn't tell me beforehand. But I think there's value to Nebraska being in the Big Ten that goes way, way beyond the athletic field. And as we've seen, the Big 12 is obviously nothing what it was going to be. Imagine Nebraska going back to a Big 12 that didn't include Texas and Oklahoma. No thanks.
So I have a last question. Sam, thank you for spending your afternoon with us.
Yeah.
Are you? I can't remember. Are your DMs open?
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
And anytime anybody ever wants to reach out with a question, great. If anybody's looking for a stringing opportunity, by that I mean freelancing, let me know. We're always looking to get freelance help where we can use it. And most of you are seniors, so you're not moving on. You're probably going on with your careers, but we also have fellowships and all the rest. So, but if anybody ever needs anything, please, by all means, reach out, chat, whatever. I appreciated having people talk to me when I was your age, and I certainly can't provide all the wisdom. Lord knows, I have a lot to learn, and I'm really imperfect in a lot of ways. But if anybody ever has any questions or concerns or wants to clarify something or wants help with something, let me know.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Sam.
God bless. Take care.
You too.